that day of the 11th month might have heralded the end of the war in Europe, but it set in train events that would give rise to and impact upon a further 5 years of armed conflict in Ireland. The election, as Eamon has shown, that followed the end of the war is best known in Ireland for the demise of constitutional nationalism and its replacement with Sinn Féin, committed to achieve independence for Ireland as a republic and to, as Sinn Féin said in their manifesto, use any and every means available to render impotent the power of England to hold Ireland in subjection by military force or otherwise. 100 years on, historians are still arguing as to what exactly that means. The result of the election offered Sinn Féin the mandate to fulfil its other manifesto promises of withdrawing from Westminster, a tradition which continues 100 years on, and of establishing an alternative republican government in Ireland, setting in train the political and administrative aspects of the revolution that would lead to independence for the 26 counties in 1921. But there are other outcomes of the 1918 election, some of which Eamon has mentioned. And I think the map I have up there really sums up a lot of what Eamon was saying, that really the 1918 election in Ulster confirmed the process which had been ongoing from the foundation of the Ulster Unionist Council in the early 20th century, whereby unionism became effectively the preserve of Ulster, with those, as Eamon says, the 23 of the 30 seats in Northern Ireland and all but one of the Belfast seats going to Unionists or Labour Unionists. The converse of unionism becoming the preserve of Ulster was that Ulster conversely effectively becomes the preserve of unionism. So Southern Unionists, Eamon mentioned a few of them there in the lost counties, but Southern Unionists even outside of Ulster are very much cut adrift, with only 2 Southern Unionists elected for Trinity College and other Dublin constituencies in 1918. All of this increased the likelihood of a partitionist solution to the Irish question. That had been brought closer by 1916 by the failed Home Rule negotiations anyway. But another outcome of the election from a wider British perspective, which also helped to ensure a partitionist solution of the nature that did evolve, was the result from a British perspective. Yes, David Lloyd George, the Liberal Prime Minister, was back as Prime Minister, but as the leader of a Conservative-dominated government. This would ensure that the allies of the Ulster Unionists in government would deliver the form of partition best suited to Ulster Unionist needs, the 6 rather than the 4 or the 9 county exclusion that, as Eamon has shown, was what was originally suggested by Walter Long. In regard to that partitionist solution that would emerge, the Irish experience is very close to the wider European experience of the time. Europe in the wake of the First World War it's a story of partition. The break-up of the Habsburg Empire with the creation of Austria and Hungary, but more so, the carving up of the Ottoman Empire gave rise to new nations where ethnic conflict still exists today. You look at the map of what was the Ottoman Empire on the eve of the war and compare it with that after the war, and you see Palestine and Syria. They were in the news 100 years ago and they are still in the news as sites of conflict today. So the Irish experience should be seen as part of a wider post-First World War European context, where partition of territory along ethnic lines was the order of the day. Another significant characteristic of the 1918 general election was it was the first parliamentary general election held in Ireland and Britain in which women had the right to vote and stand for election. And 2 women, as we know, stood for election: Winifred Carney here in Belfast and Constance Markievicz, the first woman to be elected, if not to sit in, the House of Commons. The irony of the war in this regard was that its outbreak in 1914 had curtailed the activities of the female suffrage campaign. But it was then the contribution of women to the war effort that forced the hand of the government into granting the vote to women. 1918 the franchise wasn't just extended by the granting of vote to women. There was a massive extension of male suffrage also. Women, of course, women didn't get suffrage on the same level as men in 1918. There was still a property qualification and an age differential. That would be rectified by the end of the 20s, with full adult suffrage coming in the Irish Free State in 1922 and for Great Britain and Northern Ireland by 1928. And if we're reflecting on events 100 years ago and maybe their resonance today, maybe one question we could ask ourselves is why, 100 years after the enfranchisement of women, women's role in parliamentary politics is still limited, particularly in Southern Ireland. The irony maybe of the Irish Free State being the first jurisdiction in these islands to grant full adult suffrage, it remains today the Parliament with the lowest percentage of female members, with only 22%, compared with 40 in the Welsh Assembly, 35 in the Scottish Parliament, 32 in the House of Commons and 30 in the virtual Assembly at Stormont. When the first Dáil was convening in the Mansion House on the 21st of January 1919, and also coincidentally the IRA was firing the first shots of what would become the War of Independence at Solohead Beg in Tipperary, one of Sinn Féin's elected TDs, Joe McGrath, was making good his escape from Usk prison in Wales. He, along with a significant number of the Sinn Féin TDs elected in 1918, were in prison at the time, having been rounded up in mid-1918 as part of a so-called and non-existent German plot, largely seen as Britain's revenge for the success of the Irish campaign to resist the extension of conscription to Ireland. But this planned breakout of German plot prisoners from Usk had to be postponed from December because some of their number, including Joe McGrath, had contracted influenza, part of the worldwide pandemic of 1918. Influenza killed an estimated 20,000 people in Ireland in 1918 and 1919, and approximately 20% of the population appear to have contracted it. Very hard to say exactly how many people died of influenza because so many deaths were also attributed to illnesses and conditions like pneumonia, but they probably were ancillary side effects of the flu. The virulence of the epidemic in some parts of Ireland, most notably Dublin in late 1918, was possibly exacerbated by the return of demobilised soldiers. One of Joe McGrath's fellow prisoners in Usk, Dick Coleman, no relation, died in Usk of influenza, resulting in much looser controls in the prisons where these Republican prisoners were held. That was to allow the prisoners to look after one another, and the prisoners who were in better health could help to nurse the ones who had succumbed. And particularly in the run-up to the general election, the last thing the British government wanted was Irish Republican prisoners dying of flu in prison, leading to claims of neglect. This is why it's said that the healthiest place to be in Belfast during the influenza epidemic was Crumlin Road Prison. The eventual release then of McGrath managed to get out in January, but the eventual release of all the rest of the German plot prisoners in March 1919 came when a second of them, Pierce McCann, also died of the flu, and the British at that point had probably had enough of being blamed for the deaths of Republican prisoners. The spread of the flu, possibly or in part by demobilised soldiers, was just one of many challenges ensuing from the demobilisation of tens of thousands of soldiers at the end of the war. Some unfortunate soldiers survived the war only to succumb to the H1N1 virus, like Private Michael Mulvey of the Leinster Regiment, originally from Granard, County Longford, who died of influenza in a military hospital in Wiltshire in February 1919 before he could make it back to his family in Granard, having been demobilised. Those who survived both the war and influenza returned to a very different world. Physical disabilities made it impossible for many to return to their pre-war lives and jobs, but invisible injuries proved more insidious. Many suffered from what would now be recognised as post-traumatic stress disorder. The problems of adjustment for demobilised soldiers were even greater in an Irish context, returning as they were to a country that no longer cared for, if not actively despised, their wartime experience. Housing projects for ex-soldiers cropped up all over Great Britain and Ireland in this time, But in the Irish context, returned Irish soldiers had to be housed in settlements away from their home communities. And when we get to the period of the War of Independence, recent research by Ewan O'Halpin into the statistics of civilians executed by the IRA, allegedly as spies, in 1920 and 21 indicate that ex-soldiers accounted for a disproportionately higher number of civilians executed by the IRA as spies. Demobilisation at the end of the war would also impact on subsequent events in Ireland. Many demobilised British soldiers in search of employment would eventually make their way to Ireland by 1920. Ireland on the eve of the war in 1914 was a highly militarised society. There were three armed citizen militias: the Irish Volunteer Force, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Citizen Army. The war and the Rising had a significant detrimental impact on the manpower of all these organisations. But by the end of the war, the Irish Volunteer Force had re-emerged strongly, partly and largely in response to British actions during the war. And in particular here I would mention the Conscription Crisis of March and April 1918. Looking back with hindsight, I think we can see that the Conscription Crisis, the decision to try to introduce conscription to Ireland, must stand out as one of the worst miscalculations of British policy in Ireland during this period. And I don't say that just with hindsight. If you look at the evidence of the time, the British government knew that this was not a good idea. As far back as early as 1917, well, you go back to 1916. Why was Ireland not included in conscription when it was introduced in Britain in January 1916? Because the Irish Parliamentary Party managed to convince the government that this was not a good idea. Eamon referred to the various by-elections of 1917, which did so much to rejuvenate Sinn Féin in the aftermath of the Rising and set the scene for Sinn Féin's victory in 1918. In the South Longford election of May 1917, which saw the election of an imprisoned 1916 veteran, Joe McGuinness, conscription was a hugely important event. There was a verse of doggerel appeared in one of the local newspapers which went, "They gave their benediction to an Ireland cut in two. They would glorify conscription if their lease they would renew," which tried to claim, very slyly and underhandedly, that the Irish party was favouring conscription because it had favoured voluntary recruitment. But what those events did, those contemporary events, highlight the fact that the British government knew right well that any intention to impose conscription on Ireland was going to be met with massive resistance. Lloyd George's Irish advisers went so far as to warn him that he might as well try to conscript Germans. And that, if you look at the personal statements of men who joined the Irish Volunteers in this period, invariably they talk about joining in March and April of 1918 in response to the threat of being conscripted into the British Army. So as a result of this, and I think particularly, I don't think I can underestimate how important the conscription crisis is for events in Ireland before the end of the war politically, but also for what would happen subsequently. As a result, by the end of the war, there was a rejuvenated Republican militia in Ireland that was in a position to pursue a guerrilla war for independence between 1919 and 1921. Much of that campaign was focused against the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force in Ireland, which until then had quite a good reputation in Ireland, an organisation that was seen as providing good jobs for lower middle class Catholics. At the officer level it tended to be disproportionately Protestant, but this was a domestically recruited police force and seen as very respectable until about 1920. The detrimental impact of the IRA's campaign against the RIC on the RIC's manpower and morale led to a serious depletion of the force's domestic numbers by mid-1920. Many of these men, Irish Catholics, either resigned or retired early from the force as a result of the IRA's boycott, or just a disliking for carrying out the activities which they were expected to do in this new context. This forced the British government to resort to the recruitment in Britain of temporary constables and auxiliary cadets. Many of these, which came to be known as the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, were British ex-servicemen who had returned from the war to discover no sign of the illusion or delusion that was the home fit for heroes promised to them by David Lloyd George. The collapse of wartime industries and the return of tens of thousands of soldiers seeking employment led to a post-war economic slump in the UK. Possibly not the last occasion on which a British withdrawal from Europe will lead to an economic slump at home. Is it little wonder then that after 2 years of unemployment and difficulty adjusting to civilian life after the camaraderie of the military, many of these men were attracted to well-remunerated posts in Ireland, ostensibly well-suited to men with military experience. And that's just another way in which the challenges posed by the end of the war and demobilisation would still be having an impact on Ireland by 1920. And I mentioned all the factors I've been mentioning today all gel together. I mentioned the difficulties faced by soldiers returning with what we would now recognise as PTSD. Some of the activities in the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries in Ireland are often, and occasion people question whether or not these men were suitable for these jobs. Being placed in the context of Ireland in the 1920s, where to go out in a lorry meant you might not come back. Were these men already traumatised by the war, and did this situation make it worse? And just last night I was reading Fergal Keane's new book, Wounds, about his own family's background in Kerry, and I found a very good example which I think sums up these problems. He refers to the case of a Black and Tan called William Muir, who had been incarcerated for a period by the IRA at the end of 1920. He committed suicide about 5 weeks after being released. The Army Court of Inquiry heard that Muir was on his return in a nervous and shaky condition. He cut his throat with a razor in Ballylongford RIC barracks on the 27th of December 1920. Was the dead man an already traumatised ex-soldier, driven to the brink of his abduction, or broken by physical or psychological torture at the hands of the IRA? I think possibly the answer to that question for a lot of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries who served in Ireland in the period was a mixture of all of that. So I think another way of looking at the impact of this period is to address all those challenges posed by the impact of demobilisation and how that would affect later events. So I'll draw these suggestions to a conclusion, and I think I have 3 minutes left. That's good. The end of the war and demobilisation created many challenges in Ireland. Politically, the British government had to produce a solution to the constitutional question in the altered circumstances of 1918. That task was complicated by the election which followed the end of the war and indicated that Irish demands had moved on considerably from any Home Rule style settlement that would have satisfied the majority of Irish opinion in 1914. But I think we also should take the wider view of Ireland, and Ireland and Britain in fact in this period. Most of the post-war Irish experience was not unique to Ireland. Questions of what to do with demobilised soldiers, the rise of domestic revolutionary militias, the catastrophic influenza epidemic, the demands of women for greater citizenship rights, and the partition of territory along ethnic lines were European-wide phenomena at the end of the First World War. Thank you.